Welcome to this Fleet Europe webinar about unlocking the residual value outlook, diesel versus alternative powertrain. The information shared within this webinar is subject to disclaimers, which can be viewed in detail via the recording of this session, which will be shared on fleeteurope.com website. No, diesel is not that yet. It is still the favorite fuel for both the private and corporate markets. But the question is not if that will end, but when, and how you can protect your fleet against the fallout. Dieselgate has convinced both governments and the general public that diesel is in fact, let's say, a worse pollutant than petrol because of its much higher NOx, NO2, and particulate emissions. As a result, the tax burden on buying diesels is rising across Europe, and diesels are increasingly banned also from city centers, with even countries making plans to abandon diesel sales in the near future. The rising tide of taxes and bans will push down demand, and this will reduce the residual values or the market values of the second-hand vehicles. And that will make diesels even less attractive. Or not? That is the question that we will examine today during this webinar. And we are really glad with Fleet Europe that we have two experts among us from CAP HPI. We have both Dylan Satterfield and Matthew Freeman, who are going to explain how they see, let's say, the evolution of diesel sales, the residual values related to diesel, but also compared to the other alternative powertrains. And what they are going to do in this webinar of about 45 minutes is, let's say, to give you a sort of a framework with statistics and findings about how they see the residual value forecasting for diesel vehicles versus the other powertrains. Like we always do with our webinars, we will end the webinar with a Q&A, and so you can send your question via the chat function in the webinar tool. Ladies and gentlemen, it's now time that we can go on with our first expert speaker. And if I'm not mistaken, that is Mr. Dylan Setterfield. Dylan, are you in the webinar room?
Yes, here, Stephen.
Okay, hello. Hello, and thank you that you and your organization, CAP HPI, can support this webinar on, let's say, unlocking the residual values of diesel versus alternative powertrains. So we are really excited about your story. So the webinar floor is yours.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, as you mentioned, I'm Dylan Setterfield from CAP HPI. I'm the International Forecast Manager, previously in charge of forecast values for the UK. And now as we expand out for our international operation into Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and beyond. With me is Matt from our consulting department, and we'll kind of try and share this this presentation a little one so you don't get too fed up at the sound of my voice. There are, by very nature, quite a few graphs in the presentation, but hopefully we can keep your interest going. In many ways, we're here today because of the news which broke in September 2015. And probably like some other people on the call today, I was in the office on the day that it broke, and we were deluged with phone calls and requests from national media, from the trade media, wanting to talk about the news which had broken of Volkswagen effectively falsifying results of their NOx emissions tests in the USA. And they talked to us about it, and we told them what we thought. which was that there is no evidence of any falsification within Europe and no suggestion of the same. That really the European markets were not particularly concerned about NOx emissions or even aware of NOx emissions at the time, and that we didn't think there would be any long-term impact on use values, although we did think that if it turned into a media frenzy, there could be some short-term impact. Unfortunately, none of our comments made it to national media or the TV stations or the radio stations, because they were only interested in portraying the doom and gloom, the nightmare story, diesel values disappearing into zero, Volkswagen going bust within weeks. There really was a definite media agenda to run the negative stories. And it turned into, I'm sure many of you will have heard the term, the demonization of diesel. And it's virtually every day now we see some kind of media report in one of the major markets, often on purely incorrect information, drawing very dubious conclusions. And, you know, the real strapline is, you know, the media have really not let the truth get in the way of the stories that they've wanted to put out. Stephen, if we could move on to the next slide, please. So, despite all that, we still have a lot of diesel cars on the roads. So, if you look at the registrations in the big 5 markets in the EU, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and the UK, dominated by diesel in the last 10 years. 55% of all new car registrations have been diesel, compared to 41% in petrol, and very low proportions of alternative fuels. So we've split out there hybrid and battery electric vehicles, which make up around 1%, and all others, including all hybrids and all different fuel derivatives, only making up approximately another 3%. And again, if you relate it back to the media situation, it's very easy on these low numbers for the media to produce sensationalist stories about fantastic sales figures on alternative fuel vehicles and quote some very big percentage changes, but of course they're based on still on very small numbers. The major markets still have very low penetration of alternative fuel vehicles, with some notable exceptions in some of the other countries, particularly Norway, with the investment which the government has made, and to a smaller extent in Denmark, and in the Netherlands with their rather unique tax structure, which has driven people into, in some cases, alternative fuel vehicles. We are starting to have a few more scrappage schemes in the broadest sense of the word. Some of them are not really scrappage streams in the strictest sense, and we expect to see some short-term impact. For example, with the one recently in Germany. But it needs to be noted these are very different from the scrappage schemes which we saw across Europe after the financial crisis. Those scrappage schemes were all about stimulating the new car market, getting sales on the board for the OEMs to keep their businesses ticking over. These new type of scrappage schemes, where we're generally talking about getting rid of an older, more polluting car and people being incentivized to go into a newer, less polluting car, are more about an investment in the environment. So politically, it's a very different decision to the sort of scrappage schemes that we saw a few years ago. Stephen, can we move to that? Thank you. In terms of the sheer number of cars, you can see that the number of diesel registrations across the whole of Western Europe peaked at around 8.5 million before the financial crisis. And obviously there was quite a big reduction in the immediate aftermath. And then we've seen, in face of a growing market, increased numbers of diesel cars being registered in the last 4 years, with a market share across the whole of Western Europe of around 50%, quite stable over the last 10 years, within plus minus 5%. If we then narrow that down and just look at the biggest markets on the next slide, and obviously those 5 big markets are really a very large proportion of the overall registrations, typically between 75 and 80% of that overall Western European number. So it's no surprise that we see a similar pattern on the number of registrations on the left-hand side, peaking at around 6.5 million. What we do see is a bit of variation in terms of what is the new car market share of diesel in those big 5 countries. So traditionally, France and Spain have had a much higher proportion, but of course that means they also have further to fall. Countries like the UK and Germany have typically had a slightly lower proportion of diesel. And there now seems to be, if you look at the right-hand side of that second graph, some level of convergence. And actually, from being very widely dispersed for a long period of time, most of the major markets are actually now kind of converging almost to a central point. And it should also be pointed out, if you look at the grey line in the middle, which is Italy, in fact, over the last couple of years, the diesel proportion in Italy has actually been increasing. If we then move on and look at the share of alternative fueled registrations, there is obviously one market which sticks out far and away from the others in this case, and that is the market in Italy. And where we're talking about alternative, this includes everything which is not a standard petrol or diesel internal combustion engine. So Italy stands out. France and UK have kind of the best of the rest, but pretty much everyone apart from Italy is remaining lower than 5%. And if you go back and look at some of the previous press releases and studies that were done, far, far lower than those original estimates and the plans from the manufacturers. If you go back 10 years ago, 2007, there were widely reports that by 2020, we'd be up to 30, 40, 50% alternatively fueled vehicles. And we're obviously a very, very long way away from that. So how have Italy managed to get a much higher percentage than everybody else? But if you look at how those fuels are distributed, you can see, in fact, what's unique to Italy is the role that they have in gas, in LPG and in CNG. And that's really been driven directly by the government. There's a combination of reasons why they see this big growth in natural gas as a fuel. And that's the combination of subsidies and support from the government, but also reduced tax on the fuel. And the big difference there, if you compare to most of the incentives we've seen in the major markets on electric vehicles, is that the upfront incentives aren't any use to the future used driver of those vehicles. Whereas the benefits on taxation on the fuel, they apply to everybody who's driving that type of car. Now you can probably see when the subsidies were running, they pretty much ran between 2008 and 2010. And they didn't just cover the new cars, they also covered conversion of existing cars. And as a result, they saw this big, big increase. At the same time, there was big investment in the fueling infrastructure. At the beginning of this year, there were over 1,000 stations available for the public to refuel these type of vehicles. There are also separate import terminals for natural gas, an ability to use these on not just cars, but on LCVs and HCVs as well. So the combination of those incentives, whether that be on a new car purchase, on a conversion cost, or in fact in the reductions in fuel duty, combined with the infrastructure, combined with a lot of information going out to the consumer, that resulted in very good levels of market acceptance. And you can obviously see those, some would say remarkable results in comparison to the success that's been seen in a lot of the other major markets. So if we think now, going back to the situation with diesel, it very, very clearly is different depending on what type of car we're looking at. And in a way, that's understandable if we think about the different types of driving which is done in different types of cars. If we're comparing the typical compact car, lower medium, C-segment cars, you can see quite big variation between those 5 major markets in terms of the penetration. At one stage, France almost at 90% diesel, now having reduced down to something like 57, 58%, and market like the UK peaking at around 60 and now down to just over 40%. However, if you look at executive cars, E-segment cars, upper mid-size, if you like, it's a very different picture. And the markets are much closer together in their proportion of diesel in those markets. And in some cases, that's because the driver is cruising up and down the motorway or the autobahn. In other cases, it's because the alternative to a diesel engine, in some cases, is a large petrol engine, which is also environmentally unfriendly. So it very much depends on the type of car, the usage, and obviously the driver. If we look at some of the other sectors, if we look at small SUV, for example, not only do we see a very wide variation across the market. If you think this was a market that almost didn't exist 10 years ago, so the first figures were on quite low numbers of registrations. Those registrations have increased over time. We saw very high penetration initially in France, and that probably is the one that's dropped off the most steeply. We've seen quite low levels of diesel penetration in small SUVs in Germany, only peaking at around 40%, and now down below 20%. But again, in Italy, we have quite a large proportion, even now, in terms of small SUVs diesel share, albeit on a lower number than comparing to France or to Germany. But that increase that we're seeing over the last few years is a big driver in that overall increase that we've seen in the overall registrations, because those SUV registrations are also increasing, as was discussed in the previous webinar. If we then look at the same sector, but at different size of vehicles, if you look at, oh, sorry, Stephen, can you just go back to the previous one? We're looking at the larger SUVs. Then here we do see very, very high levels of penetration of diesel in the sector, because it makes more sense on the larger vehicles, typically being used for different types of purposes. So it could be towing, could be, in case of large SUVs, large MPVs, transportation of people. It's not just the physical size, it's also comparing to what is the petrol option. And again, often those petrol options are a much larger unit, not only with worse environmental characteristics, but also with much poorer fuel economy. So that's the situation if you're looking at those big markets, big variation across the different markets, and big variations within the market in terms of those traditional vehicle sectors. I'll hand over to Matt, and Matt's going to go into a bit more detail on the overall situation with diesel and how it relates more directly to fleets.
Thank you, Dylan. So if we look at this chart here, what we're going to look at in this section is some of the drivers, again, to carry on with Dylan's theme, but also look at some of the attendant risks that we start to face as we start to move away, as we unfortunately will, from diesel. So this, first of all, is an indication of how far we've come and how much we've achieved in terms of CO2 emission reduction. So if we look on the chart at 2000, we were looking at about 180 or just over 180 grams per kilometre of CO2. And if we look at the latest full year figure, we managed to get that down as an industry to 120 grams. And we achieved that not exclusively, but primarily because of the growth of diesel. And obviously, if you were to overlay some of the charts that Dylan has run through in the previous section, you can see that there is obviously a correlation. The more diesel we've had, the lower our CO2 emissions. However, this isn't the end of the story. Those CO2 targets continue to tighten, And by 2021, the industry is mandated to hit 95 grams per kilometre. That is going to be extremely difficult without diesel. And this, of course, is the first issue that the industry faces, and particularly the manufacturers, because as you all know, I'm sure, there are significant penalties for vehicle manufacturers who fail to hit their CO2 targets to contribute towards that reduction. So the first thing is, how did we get here? We got here because we were driven by government, driven by environmental regulations and driven by legislation. And what does this mean for us? Well, that legislation is still in place, those targets are still in place, and therefore the attendant risk is significant financial burden to the industry if it fails to hit those targets. It's also worth recalling that many customers, be they private buyers or be they in particular fleet buyers, also have their own internal targets for CO2 reduction. Most large organizations now publish sustainability or environmental reports alongside their usual financial figures, and they too aim to reduce their CO2 emissions as a business or as an organization. And so they too have an interest in diesel and the maintenance of diesel, because they too will struggle to be able to hit their own internal targets if they don't have access to those. If we move to the next slide, we can see how the industry rose to the challenge of those targets. And they rose to it on a very simple level by producing more diesel vehicles. I think we can all probably guess that was a solution. But what they also did was produce better diesels. And for those of us old enough to remember back into the 1990s, diesels were very much, as we saw from Dylan's charts, a minority choice. They were a very select group of customers that opted for diesels, or they were driven by very particular market structures around Europe. And there's been an explosion in the choice and also the quality of diesel products over the last 20 years. And what this has meant is that most manufacturers now are producing vehicles which are actively chosen by the new and also by the used customer over petrol. Diesels are now not just more refined and not just cleaner and not just quieter than they were before, they're also nicer to drive. And many consumers are now, in fact, quite used to driving diesel engines. And that's something that will be a challenge to manufacturers moving them into new engines and new powertrains to ensure that they are educated as to the change that they're going to be facing. But if we look at UK diesel sales by brand for last year, you can see there's some pretty significant, sorry, could you go back to the previous chart? You can see there's some pretty significant share of diesel there. Topping the board, you have Land Rover with virtually all of its output in the UK market going into diesel. All the premium, many of those brands are of course premium brands, and they in fact have led the way and in many cases, as you would expect, set the standards for diesel quality and diesel refinement, and customers have moved accordingly. And in particular, when we have an industry and a marketplace which tends to look to diesel and look to premium brands, then not surprisingly, that's what you get, a significant shift in that direction. If you can move on. The other major driver, and certainly in the UK market, but also in the other European markets which have a significant fleet sector, is fleet. And fleets, of course, have two real reasons for choosing diesel. One is, as aside, of course, from things like their environmental requirements, one is that diesels are more fuel efficient, and for businesses with an eye to the bottom line, choosing the more efficient powertrain makes a lot of sense. But there's also the fact that for both businesses and particularly for user choosers who have the vehicle as a benefit, there's also a tax advantage. And so for those businesses, we've seen a huge expansion. If we look at this chart here, what you can see is the volume of diesel that goes into the private market, which is in the lighter color, and in the darker color, the volume that goes into the fleet market. And obviously we have an almost twice the volume going into the fleet market compared with the private market. So it's pretty clear where some of the risk is going to lie if we start to have a negative impact on diesel availability and also on diesel residual value. We can see this perhaps even better if we look at a real-world example. And so on the next slide, what we've done here is we've taken a typical UK fleet. This is actually a real-world example. Obviously, we've anonymized the business. It's a moderately sized fleet run by a company in the UK. And of their fleet, as you can see from there, 93% of the vehicles in their fleet are diesel. They have 1% petrol, and they have the remainder in alternative fuels. And most of those alternative fuels are plug-in hybrids. And because of the way that the British tax system for company cars works, and there's the particular benefit for plug-in hybrids, that doesn't surprise us at all. And so consequently, this business is very heavily invested in diesel technology. So there's an attendant risk to that. And if we look at the next slide, we've tried to quantify that in a very simple way by looking at the impact of a diesel residual value decline. So if we were to have an across the board, and I stress that this is a somewhat blunt instrument, a way of drawing attention to it rather than measuring it in a scientific way. If we were to have an across the board decline in value of 1%, then you can see that we would have a modest, but nevertheless, probably important for that company impact on the value of their fleet. Move that to 5%, and you're looking at about 1.4 million wiped off the value of their fleet. If you take it to 10, obviously 2.8, and if you take it out to 20%, which would be a catastrophic decline, and something we wouldn't expect to see, and would hope not to see, I think, then you would be looking at well over £5.5 million written off the value of that company's fleet. So there's obviously quite a lot of risk involved in this. So I'll hand back to Dylan now, and Dylan's going to look at some of the factors that we need to look for that will warn us of that upcoming risk.
Yeah, so obviously one of the things that we look at very closely, and I'm sure most people in the fleet industry look at very closely, are the used values. So we've got an example where we look at Volkswagen Golf, and sorry, Stephen, if we go to the page, thank you. And there's obvious reasons for choosing Volkswagen Golf. Popular car, familiar with everybody in each of the markets. It highlights several of the essential market features, but also obviously it has the association with the Dieselgate scandal that kind of kicked all this off in 2015. It mentions the current vehicles in the small print on the bottom left. We're actually here looking at UK values at 3 years and 60,000 miles, a typical fleet benchmark. Obviously, those current vehicles aren't 3 years old. So actually the data, for example, for the petrol is from the old 1.4 engine with a 1 litre TSI engine only being introduced in 2015. But if you look at those values for the 1 litre TSI that are available, it actually implies similar differences between petrol and diesel for that engine as we see here on the 1.4. So if you look back over the history, you can see going back through time, there was quite a big premium for diesel over petrol. And that was part of the inherent choice for fleets, because it might have had a higher initial purchase price, but a lot of that was recouped at the back end with a higher residual value. We actually then had a period, sorry, Stephen, could we stay on that one? We actually then had a period where the values went quite close together, which you can see from the graph from the index at the bottom, started well before any of the Dieselgate scandal broke. And what you can also see on the far right-hand side is the strength that we've seen in petrol vehicles. If we look at the values today on that petrol Golf, they're currently up around 13% year over year at 3 years 60. And some of these cars have actually been appreciating in value over the last 12 months. And clearly, if we'd have baked that into our forecast 12 months ago, then people would be wondering what we were talking about. Now, that petrol strength probably isn't sustainable and is maybe slightly overcooked at the moment, but we expect in broad terms, the future scenario for these type of cars to be more likely to be one of a small petrol premium, where historically there always used to be a diesel premium. So if we look at what that term means in terms of the comparisons, the differences between the petrol and the diesel values, on the next slide, you can see we've gone from a situation of an average premium of something like £1,500 to a difference in favour of petrol of around £1,000. Say that extreme result is largely driven not by weakness in the diesel value, but actually by the strength in the petrol value. Those diesel values, if you look at the last 12 months at 3 years 60, were actually up year over year, albeit by 1.6% compared to the 13% that we saw on petrol. But over the space of 2 years, if you compare back to October 2015, effectively since the Dieselgate scenario, only come down 1.7% across the space of 2 years. So much more favourable than we would expect from a typical model aging scenario. If we then move on, we can see in terms of demand, there obviously has been significant decrease, as we've seen in most of the markets, in the diesel share of new car registrations. In a lot of these markets, we're also seeing a slight reduction in used demand. And mostly that's displaying itself in markets like Germany by increasing cycle time, longer days to sell, lengthening for diesel, shortening for petrol. And if you compare percentage of list relationships, we're already seeing in markets like Germany, for a lot of the smaller cars, then historically we've seen in a lot of cases an advantage in terms of percentage of list price for petrol over the diesel. But now we're also starting to see or starting to forecast that there will be a difference in terms of the euro value as well. So it is, if we move on to the next page, a very delicate situation. And some of those historic diesel premiums that we've seen were particularly hard to justify. So even as recently as 12 months ago, we could see 1 year ex-rental stock in Germany with a premium for diesel over petrol, which was larger than the list price difference. And if you go back, you saw that history in the UK, it's not the surprise that the premiums came down. The surprise is really that it took so long for them to produce in most of these markets. Now, most of our major markets are now accustomed to large levels of supply of diesel used vehicles, especially where we have large fleet concentrations. And we've seen these registrations are starting to decrease. What that also does in the future is reduce that future used car supply of diesel vehicles. Now, it also may take some time for it to fully filter through into the fleet situation. These are things that impact it, like choice lists. If you're on a diesel-only choice list, you can't order a petrol or you can't order an alternative fuel vehicle. And it can take a long time for these things to change. But as fewer of these diesel cars come back into the used market, we expect there to be some limited support in terms of their used values, particularly in those middle sectors, lower medium C sector, medium SUV. But we don't really expect there to be a return to the diesel premiums for the smaller cars that we've seen in the past. They never had big penetration in things like city car and super mini because it generally makes far less sense in those sectors than it does for the larger cars. And we've got changes in a lot of countries in terms of legislation. We move on to the next slide with lots of places talking about low emission zones. So in Stuttgart, for example, they want to ban all diesels or all diesels excluding Euro 6. But there's a big argument going on about who can legally implement it. Is it the city? Is it the state? Is it central government? And also, these things aren't cheap, and who's going to pay for it? We've been talking to the Energy Saving Trust in the UK, and they've shared that, number one, the civil servants are going to find it very difficult to meet the timescales that the Mayor of London has imposed, but also it's going to take years for these schemes to break even. They're perceived as being money-making schemes, and maybe they will be in the long run, but in the short term, it takes investment to set them up. We also need to see that these schemes are driving the right behaviour. So in Westminster and the centre of London, similar to Stuttgart, a blanket ban or blanket surcharge for parking diesel cars, all diesel cars. So if you had a Fiat 500 diesel, you had to pay double. But if you had a 15-year-old 4.5 litre petrol Range Rover, that was fine, nearly 400 grams per kilometre of CO2, driving the wrong behaviour. It also needs to be clear. So there's recently an announcement in France about the latest incentives and proposals, which wasn't widely announced in the media. And the reason for that, because hardly anybody could understand it. So these things need to be clear. Also, think about the situation if you're driving across several borders in Europe, and every city you drive near has a different scheme. So particularly within country, there needs to be national frameworks, and that's at the centre of that argument that you see in Germany. So what are the strategies for the future, Matt?
Well, Dylan, if we move on, we'll start looking at some of the things that fleets and other organisations can start doing, and some good news after all of that. So the first thing we'll look at is the current performance of some of the alternative fuel vehicles in the marketplace. And we have some good news here. So if we look at the next slide, what you'll see is the current performance of the Golf range. So looking at GTI, GTD, the e-Golf and the GTE. And we've had, if you look to the right-hand side of that chart, a quite interesting movement of the GTE. A vehicle that really took a little bit of time to find its place in the market. At first, it was thought to be parallel with a GTI, and then it dropped to a GTD. But what's happened is it's taken the place almost of the GTD as the number 2 performer in that segment. The e-Golf continues to struggle, but since the beginning of the year, we've had a positive residual value performance. And these are fairly short cycle vehicles, but I think it's worth bringing these up just to show you that there is a positive message. And if we look at the next chart, we also, again, now looking towards some of the forecast data, we can also see that in longer term, the GTE is performing better than many of the other versions of the Golf. So the message there is that the market is starting to reflect the more positive view of those particularly plug-in hybrids, and to a lesser extent, the electric vehicles. And consequently, we're starting to move, I think, away from the diesel model and all the benefits that we thought we had with diesel in terms of residual value. And those benefits are now being transferred to other variants of the vehicle. If we look at the next slide, just to give you an indication of the kind of residual values that we at CAP are forecasting for these vehicles, you can see that the e-Golf continues to lag, but is only now about £600–700 behind the GTD. And the Golf GTE, we're now forecasting as being ahead of the pack. So it would be the most valuable of all the variants of the Golf in that £30,000 to £32,000 price bracket. So just to reiterate, that's, I think, a positive message. What does that mean in real terms? Well, if we look at total cost of ownership, and we move to the next slide, what you can see here is the total calculation of ownership of a typical fleet vehicle for typical fleet life cycle of 36 months and 60,000 miles. So, of course, the biggest proportion of cost for any vehicle ownership cycle is going to be depreciation. We add to that some service maintenance and repair charges and fuel. And you can see that the GTE is the cheapest or the least expensive of all of those vehicles to run. And if we look at it as a monthly TCO cost, it comes in at about £629. So that's cheaper even than the electric Golf, the e-Golf, which of course is zero rated for fuel because electricity is not currently taxed as a fuel, and which is also cheaper than the diesel, and of course also, as you would expect, from the petrol. So we're starting to see real world examples now of how and where the market can move to. On the other hand, there is still going to be a place for diesel. We are hearing an awful lot, of course, about all of the new electric vehicles that are coming to the marketplace. We know that there are a huge number of EVs planned to be launched from 2020 onwards. and that plug-in hybrids and hybridization of vehicles will become pretty much standard over the next decade. But if we move to the next slide, there's just a few things that we need to bear in mind before we get carried away with the idea that we can all abandon diesels tomorrow and all go into plug-in hybrids. There really isn't capacity currently anywhere in the world to be producing that number of vehicles. We know that the battery plants are being built. We know that the manufacturers have plans for the vehicles. They're changing over capacity and so forth. But fundamentally, we don't have the production capacity either for the vehicles or for the batteries. We don't have a charging network that could cope with the number of vehicles that we were purported to be having on the market, let alone what we actually already have. And at the end of the day, we really don't have the power infrastructure to cope with it either. And I think we're also starting to now get in the media, alongside all the anti-diesel stories, we're starting to get a few cautionary tales being put out around some of the issues we might find if we were to move too quickly. And that, I think, is a good thing because it will help temper expectations as to how fast we can move. You know, we can't have a situation where everyone switches over and the grid falls over because we're unable to cope with all the charging being done at the same time. We also have to bear in mind that this is an industry that involves selling a product to people, and people's perceptions and attitudes have to be carefully managed around this issue. We've started off, or Dylan started off by explaining some of the slightly outlandish stories and irresponsible stories that were being spread around diesel and continue to do so. But we're still in a situation where the alternative technology hasn't quite bedded itself in with the public. So if we move to the next slide, we can just see a little example of some of the research that we've done at CAP HPI, partnering with a local university and using our access to a huge pool of potential customers through our sister brand HPI. We asked people, okay, what would you think about buying an electric car? Would you be happy? And the vast majority of people are really just not sure. There's a few people who are quite happy, seem to be reasonably understanding of the technology. There are almost the same number of people who are unhappy with the idea. Most people just don't know. They have vague concerns around battery life, around the sustainability of the batteries, around components, whether the vehicles are powerful enough, which is very strange for those of us who've driven electric cars and know the kind of acceleration you could achieve with them. So we still have a situation where people are waiting to be told and educated that they can be moved across into that new technology. So if we move on again, we can see where we think the market is likely to move. Basically, you know, if we continue with the current trends, we are obviously seeing a decline in diesel volumes, but what we're not seeing is a catastrophic fall off a cliff decline. If we continue with the current trend, then by around the mid-2020s, the middle of 2020, we'd still be looking at about 30% of the marketplace. And remember, it took us quite a long time, you cast your mind back to that first slide, to get from around 10 to 15% of the European market up to over 50%. That took us, well, nearly 20 years. So, you know, this is probably going to be a faster decline process, but it can only happen so quickly. It is going to be bound by the natural supply and demand cycle. And what we're obviously hoping to see is that that natural supply and demand cycle gets us out of this situation in a relatively painless way. We're also going to see continued investment, I think, in diesel in the short to medium term, under pressure and with, I think, a recognition from the authorities that diesel still has a part to play in the market. We'll be seeing technological innovations continue to improve the cleanliness and efficiency of diesel. So we'll continue to see technologies introduced, things like exhaust after treatments, variable compression ratio technology, cylinder deactivation, and things like electric turbochargers, which continue to make diesel a viable product in the marketplace.
Yeah, if we just try and just briefly wrap up the session, really, is that there's a slide, all diesels are not created equal. And there are massive differences in terms of the environmental impact of the oldest diesel cars and today's newest diesel cars. And Euro 5 and Euro 6 make up more than 50% of the total of the diesel cars now which are on our roads. NOx is an issue, but in most countries, NOx emissions are actually significantly decreasing. You might be forgiven for not realizing that, because most of the media articles imply, if they don't actually say it, that NOx is getting worse. Governments have got a real choice now. They could put together sensible, sustainable, long-term solutions in terms of taxation and duty and incentives to clean up our roads and clean up the environment. But we don't want to move from a CO2 focus purely to a NOx focus. NOx is more of a local issue. CO2 is still a global issue and needs attention. And also, if we do move to more battery electric vehicles, there will come a stage where governments will make some kind of move to recoup any of that lost revenue that we've seen. There's also more to life than just passenger cars. Although most of us focus on passenger cars most of the time, in the LCV and HGV world, commercial vehicles, diesel is still by far the dominant fuel because it makes so much more sense. There is work ongoing to try and find some more acceptable solutions. There are lots of little pilot schemes going around everywhere, but cost and usability are the big obstructions there. At the bottom in the middle of the slide, there's a nice white fridge van. There was some analysis presented to EU Commission in Brussels in 2015. The 1 million fridge vans on EU roads have the equivalent CO2 output as 56 million diesel cars. So less than the 44 million that we've registered in the big 5 markets in the last 10 years. So there will be continued investment in diesel technology, almost purely because it's needed for that LCV sector. It's all about finding the right car for the customer. Horses for courses, as we say in the UK. So high mileage vehicles, large heavy vehicles, anything that's towing or carrying a lot of people, then we expect there to still be significant demand for diesel. Diesel will probably die out in the smaller cars. It never had big penetration in things like city car and super mini anyway, and most OEMs are stopping or have already stopped production of diesel cars in those sectors. So it's all about offering fleet customers the best solution for them. And there is always an impact between supply and demand. And we've seen here it's a very delicate balance, a lot of variation by vehicle sector and across the individual markets. The biggest unknown that we have is the effect of possible local legislation. I think Stephen referred in the introduction to the proposed bans in 2040 in the UK and France. I find it quite ridiculous, really, that anyone is talking about government policy 23 years into the future. The world is very different now to what it was 23 years ago, and it will be very different in 23 years ago from what it is today. So if we give customers the right information, then they should be able to make the right decisions. We've seen that significant move away from the established diesel market share, but big variation by country and vehicle sector. Still a low proportion of alternative fuels with big barriers to mass adoption. We've seen reductions in diesel use values, which have in a lot of cases diminished, but often not eliminated, a cost advantage of the life of the vehicle over petrol. But we still think there'll be huge demand for the right diesel cars and very, very complex future supply and demand relationships. It's not going to get any simpler. So all the best information, try and get customers to make the right decisions.
We can go on to the Q&A session together with Dylan and Matthew after this wonderful presentation and the insight that they have given us about diesel, the residual values for diesel, and the comparisons with the other alternative powertrains. I see that there are already some questions that have popped up. The first one is related, let's say, to one of the final comments that was made. The question is really simple. So if we understand you correct, it's not really the right deal and really reality that countries would have no diesel by 2030, 2040. Is that true? You don't believe that that will happen?
That wasn't what I said. The UK and France, the 2040, what they're both talking about is banning the sale of all internal combustion engine cars, so all petrol and all diesel. So I'm not saying at all that we might not have diesel in 23 years' time. The world changes a lot in 23 years. If you go back 23 years ago from today, then nobody had heard of a Toyota Prius. There was still apartheid in South Africa. So the market will be very different in 2040 to what it is today. But governments announcing legislation for 23 years into the future, I do find quite ridiculous. We'll probably get 5 changes of government in that time.
I think it's also worth remembering, as Dylan says, you know, that we're looking a long way into the future here, and there's a lot of other things that change in the marketplace. And one of those is ownership, or the patterns of ownership. And we've seen in the UK in the last few years, in the last 5-10 years, a massive change in the way that people buy cars, that people have stopped buying on conventional hire purchase, where they own the car at the end of the payment period, to PCPs, personal contract purchase, where they never really own the car, and in fact never intend to. And, you know, the car is handed back and you get a new one. Who knows where we'll be in 23 years? You know, 23 years ago, taxis were either, you know, hackney carriages or they were minicabs. And now we have lots and lots of alternatives. There were very few car clubs 23 years ago. The idea of communal ownership of a vehicle was not something that was normal. So there's a lot of things that could, I mean, some of these things could change. Some of these changes could facilitate us moving away. Other things, on the other hand, may actually start reinforcing some of the existing technologies, because they're the best way to do it at the most cost-effective way.
I mean, one of the things we haven't mentioned today is hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, mainly because to date so few of them have been registered. But, you know, we've talked about those significant barriers to mass adoption of battery electric vehicles, and in the same way, if there is big technological advantages in battery technology over the next 10-15 years, maybe that might happen. But also maybe there might be big advances in transportation, supply, generation of hydrogen for hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, which would also make a lot of sense.
The second topic is related to some of the figures and let's say explanation you made around the TCO of the different vehicles. Some of the participants believe that you have said that in the examples, let's say, of the Volkswagen Golf, the electric one, that the TCO analysis is that this is a fuel cost for electricity vehicles is 0. But of course, there is the electricity and the charging infrastructure and so on. Do you have any idea about the cost value of that, and how, as a fleet, you should calculate and take that into your TCO?
I mean, it depends. If you have on-site charging facilities, then potentially the fleet would bear the cost for that. But I think in a lot of cases, we're still talking about people charging vehicles at home. So whether they are allowed to claim something back subject to benefit in kind taxation. The longer term question, which we mentioned, is the fact that even if it is virtually 0 cost today, and the cost of charging electric vehicles is far less than filling it full of petrol or diesel, then governments know this. And in the future, I would expect if there's growth in electric vehicles, electricity to be taxed as a fuel, which would make an enormous difference to the cost of doing that for those vehicles that we have on the market today.
I think there's a really interesting debate in the future that's going to spring up around electric vehicles and how the whole value of that vehicle type is going to be calculated. Because, I mean, on a very basic level, as Dylan says, we've now already starting to have questions as to, well, how do we deal with the fuel? How do we deal with actually recognizing electricity as a fuel? We have, as you can see, as you'll have seen on that on the figures I showed, generally they are cheaper to maintain, many fewer moving parts, and that's a great advantage. But it's less of an advantage to the people who make money from servicing vehicles. So that's an issue. But we also have things about the actual content value of those vehicles. They're very different to the internal combustion engines or combustion engine cars that we're used to dealing with over the last 100-odd years. You know, you've got something in there, the battery pack, which has potentially a multiple life cycle future ahead of it in a way that most of the content of a car really doesn't. And as you can already see this with some of the car companies. Either, you know, the most obvious example is Tesla, who is building a life cycle around those battery packs, but also the traditional manufacturers are also looking into this as well, as to what happens to those battery packs when they come out of the car. Not something we're used to dealing with, and that value is going to have to be recognized, I think, in future. So there's a whole debate and a whole scoping out that's going to have to be done around this, and we in the residual value business are going to have to be part of that conversation.
There's also a big impact on the particular plug-in hybrids from driving style. So how much of the driving is ever done on electric and how much is done from conventional fuel. In exactly the same way as, you know, if we're calculating these numbers, we will use a typical fuel consumption figure. Whereas we know if 5 of us all drove the same car around the same route, we would all use different amounts of fuel. So there's variation from that perspective as well.
Another topic that we haven't really touched upon, but can be also linked to the outcome of your presentation, is of course the new rules with regard to the testing schemes and the WLTP. In what way would you reconsider your conclusion on residual values with the WLTP in place? Because that will also affect, let's say, emissions, outcome, statistics of the different powertrains.
Yeah, it's quite difficult because the EU pushed forward with WLTP before anybody, governments, the industry, before anybody was ready for it. One of the things that we expect to see is that some of the plug-in hybrids may look less attractive under the new regime because of the longer driving cycle. There'll be less impact from driving under the electric situation. In the medium term and the short term, I don't expect to see any impact at all, because it's going to take quite a while to transition from the current situation to the new situation. And not all diesels in particular are the same in terms of differences from achieved fuel economy and published fuel economy. Some manufacturers are far better than some others. I've had cars before where I've exceeded the official fuel economy, and I've had cars where I've not got within 20%. So, you know, it will help in terms of giving people more accurate numbers in terms of the performance of the car, but there will be a long transition period between understanding and feeding through into market prices.
Before that we end, 2 quick questions. The first one is a little bit in line with the opening question, where we talked about some of the countries that have announced ambitious plans, and that's the question. What about the cities and the low emission zones in these cities? We have already today around 200 low emission zones in Europe. Those are real. In what way will they, let's say, a little bit shuffle the powertrain mix in fleets, and how to deal with that in the near future in terms of keeping your residual values in the right shape?
Yeah, so it needs to be part of that kind of harmonized situation of cleaning up the environment and improving the vehicles which are out on the roads. I said there is a very big danger that you get lots of disparate schemes, and some of which drive the wrong behavior. So what we should be doing is incentivizing people to get cars off the road, petrol and diesel, which are certainly pre-Euro 3, because those are the most polluting vehicles. Over time, as those older vehicles come off the road and are replaced with newer vehicles, we'll see even more improvements. A lot of the low emission zones have been off the basis of NOx emissions reports and the work that the EU started 7 or 8 years ago, where they were looking at NOx emissions in individual cities. The UK actually has a national framework, and the first version of that national framework didn't include passenger cars at all. They have since changed that so that it is possible now for local authorities to penalise, whether that's by charging or by not allowing access to certain parts. They've allowed them pre-Euro 5. So Euro 5 and Euro 6 is still okay. Those older vehicles are the ones which are being targeted. But there's a real danger that everyone slips into from a CO2 focus to a NOx focus, and it starts to drive all the wrong behaviour.
Okay. And then the final one, can we, let's say, conclude with the fact that fleets today in Europe, with the diesel vehicles in their fleet, they don't have to worry so much when it comes to, let's say, the residual values of their vehicles in terms of rising of leasing prices and so on.
Sorry, Stephen, could you repeat that question?
Yes, as fleets in Europe have, let's say, Euro 5, Euro 6 diesel cars in their fleet, is it true that based on what you have presented, that they don't have to worry so much if we look at all the things that you have presented, all the stats and so on, in terms of the residual value for their diesel vehicles?
Yeah, I mean, they should be less concerned. But again, a lot depends on that local legislation. And if there is punitive legislation which penalises those cleaner diesel cars, then we would expect those to suffer as well. But we think that would be the wrong thing for governments to do.
And I think industry bodies, whether it's fleet or whether it's from the manufacturer or the trade side, are trying to educate, certainly, and to lobby governments to ensure that they don't throw all the vehicles out through the window because they're all diesel, and that there is a difference, and that Euro 6 is an incredibly clean and efficient powertrain, and it would be a mistake to allow that to be damaged in the way that many of the older diesels are too. I think really we're at a point now where this is a good opportunity for fleets to start assessing where they want to be in the future. Most fleets are, say, on a 3-year cycle in terms of looking at vehicles. As Dylan said earlier, it's an opportunity to see what's being made available. It's an opportunity to assess what the drivers are actually doing with the vehicles, whether it's appropriate for them to have those vehicles, what kind of vehicles they ought to have. Whether if as we're seeing with the manufacturers are starting to pull diesel engines out of the smaller segment vehicles, that if your drivers should or want smaller cars, you're going to have to let them have petrols. If they are lobbying for PHEVs, they have to be the kind of driver that should be driving a PHEV, not purely for the tax advantage.
And be educated about how to drive them.
Exactly. I think it's a great opportunity to start that process and to get fleets in a good position to deal with the future.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dylan Setterfield and Matthew Freeman, for your insights and all the expertise that you have shown during this webinar.